A railroad, not built by the steel barons of Wall Street, not funded by the oil kings or the banking elite, but by men and women who had once been enslaved. People who were told they had nothing, people who were told they were nothing, and yet they dared to lay their own tracks across America's soil. Picture the scene: a train thundering through open fields, the iron wheels screaming against the rails, smoke cutting across the sky like a banner of defiance. On the platform, black entrepreneurs in pressed suits, hands calloused from labor, but eyes burning with vision. Behind them, communities cheering, children waving, mothers crying. And in the shadows, the rivals, the railroad tycoons, men with money, power, and hatred in their eyes. They watched with rage as an empire rose where they said no empire could exist. Because this wasn't just a railroad. It was a declaration of freedom. It was ownership. It was power. But then, silence. The story disappeared. History buried it beneath dust and lies. So the question is, how did a group society tried to silence manage to build what others said was impossible? The year is 1870. The Civil War is over. The smoke of battle has cleared, but the scars are everywhere. America is rebuilding, but not equally. For the powerful, this was the age of steel, of money, of expansion. Railroads were more than tracks. They were veins of power pulsing through the nation, carrying wealth, carrying influence. Whoever controlled the railroads controlled America. And yet, for millions of newly freed black men and women, freedom was not truly freedom. They were free in name, but shackled in opportunity. Banks slammed their doors shut. Too risky, they said. Land deeds were stolen in the night. Politicians passed laws that strangled black progress before it could even begin. And in the South, mobs patrolled the darkness, reminding everyone that violence could come at any hour for any reason. It was a world designed to break hope, to remind them that the levers of wealth and power would never belong to them. So imagine the thought: a black-owned railroad, a steel empire not owned by the Vanderbilts or the Carnegies, but by the very people America tried to silence. To the powerful, it wasn't just unlikely, it was laughable, unthinkable, impossible. And yet, in small rooms behind church doors, something began to stir. Whispers, plans, dreams. Communities pooling what little they had. Dollars and dimes collected in tin cups. Secret investors taking unimaginable risks. Pastors standing before congregations and declaring, "We will build our own future, mile by mile, rail by rail." It wasn't just business. It was survival. It was dignity. It was a declaration that they would not wait for permission to rise. But who had the courage to step forward first? Who would stand against the banks, the mobs, and the railroad kings? Who would risk everything to lay the first track of this forbidden empire? Imagine standing in a crowded church in 1871. The wooden pews creak under the weight of farmers, laborers, and families who have walked miles just to hear one thing: hope. At the front, a preacher lifts his voice above the hum of kerosene lamps. Not about heaven, not about the next life, but about this one. About a dream of steel and fire. A dream of a railroad that would belong not to the wealthy, not to the white tycoons, but to them. They called themselves visionaries. Some were entrepreneurs, men who had scraped together small businesses from nothing but grit. Some were pastors, whose pulpits became rallying cries for liberation through ownership. And some were former Union soldiers, men who had marched through war, who had stared down death and refused to kneel. They knew railroads meant more than trains. They meant jobs for fathers, dignity for mothers, mobility for children who might never again be told to stay in their place. Picture the letters they wrote, ink-stained, trembling with both pride and desperation. To build this railroad, one wrote, is to build our freedom. Picture the speeches at town halls. Farmers in overalls patched with threadbare cloth, slamming their fists on tables and declaring, "If we build it, our children will never know the chains we knew." Picture the rallies, hundreds gathered in dusty fields, women selling pies to raise funds, children carrying buckets of nails, pretending to build their future with their own small hands. This wasn't Wall Street. This wasn't backed by bankers in silk hats. This was powered by belief, by sweat, by the desperate refusal to be erased. But as their dream grew louder, so did the whispers. Not everyone celebrated this rising empire. Eyes were watching from the shadows. Men in tailored suits, men in smoky offices, men who had built their fortunes on the belief that only they could rule the rails. And so the question became, if these visionaries were daring enough to build their own railroad, who was already plotting to tear it down? Imagine building your dream, only to discover that every step forward comes with a hand pushing you back. That was the reality for the black-owned railroad. Because the moment whispers of its construction reached the ears of America's white railroad barons, panic spread.
These tycoons weren't just businessmen. They were kings. They owned politicians. They owned newspapers. They owned towns. And they weren't about to let former slaves carve into their empire. Competition was a threat, and this kind of competition, unthinkable. So the attacks began. Banks quietly blacklisted black investors. Loans were denied without explanation. Credit was cut off even for those with spotless records. It was as if the financial world had conspired in silence. Starve the dream before it grows. And when money couldn't stop them, violence took its place. Imagine men laying track by lantern light, only to hear horses charging in the distance. Riders masked, armed with rifles, tearing up rails in the night. Beatings in broad daylight. Threats scrawled across doorways, "Stop or else." Even politicians joined the assault. New laws suddenly appeared, laws that required special licenses, or higher fees, or safety inspections designed to choke black ownership before a train ever left the station. Every mile of track was laid not just with sweat, but with fear. And yet, the obstacles weren't only external. Inside the movement, cracks began to show. The money ran thin. Arguments broke out over strategy. Some investors pulled back, afraid of losing everything. And others, worse, betrayed the cause, selling secrets to rivals in exchange for safety. Exhaustion gnawed at the workers. Imagine digging, hammering, and hauling for months, only to see progress ripped apart overnight. The body grows tired, the spirit even more so. And still they pushed, still they dreamed. Because every time the whistle of a rival train screamed across the horizon, it wasn't just steel on rails. It was a reminder. They control our movement, They control our destiny. And so, with enemies circling, money running dry, and violence at their doorsteps, the question became unavoidable. When the pressure mounted to its breaking point, how would they fight back? Imagine being told you cannot own, you cannot build, you cannot dream. And then imagine saying, "We will anyway." That's what happened next. When every door was slammed shut, black communities across America pried open their own. Farmers stepped forward first. Men who worked sun up to sun down, who barely scraped enough to feed their families. They offered the only wealth they had, land. Plots of earth carved from sweat and survival, donated to a cause bigger than themselves. Then came the churches. Hymns turned into fundraisers. Collections once meant for candles and hymn books were now poured into steel and timber. Pastors told their congregations, "This railroad is not just for today. It is for our children. It is for freedom itself." And then the workers. They had no machines, no fleets of hired engineers, just muscle, shovels, axes, bare hands blistered and bleeding. Every rail hammered into the ground was a prayer. Every spike driven into wood was a defiance. Every tie laid across the dirt was a message. We will not wait for permission to exist. Days blurred into nights. Lanterns burned until dawn. The sound of hammers echoed across the fields like war drums. And then it happened. The first train. The first black-owned train, born not from wealth but from sacrifice, cut across the land. Imagine the scene. Children lining the tracks, waving rags and flags, running barefoot in the dust. Mothers holding babies high, tears streaking their faces. Fathers gripping each other's hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. The whistle pierced the air, long, sharp, victorious. Not just steel on rails, but history in motion. For a moment, the impossible was real. A train owned by the very people who were never supposed to rise. A train that carried not only passengers, but dignity. Not only freight, but freedom. It should have been the beginning of a new empire. It should have been the dawn of equality in industry. But power never yields easily. And for every child cheering that train's arrival, there was a rival tycoon in a smoke-filled room watching with rage. For every farmer celebrating his land put to use, there was a politician drafting new laws to strangle the dream. And for every whistle of victory, there was silence on the horizon where enemies plotted their next move. Because as triumphant as that first ride was, the fight was far from over. The greatest trial had not yet begun, and soon this empire would face a battle that would decide not just whether the trains could run, but whether the dream itself could survive. The trains are running. The dream is alive. But in the shadows, the knives are out. Rivals strike first. Sabotage along the tracks. Bolts loosened, spikes pulled from the earth, rails bent under the cover of night. Then come the lawsuits. Endless papers stamped and filed, dragging the company into courtrooms they could never afford. And when paper wasn't enough, money sealed the deal. Politicians bought and paid for, writing laws designed to choke the black-owned line out of existence. And yet the trains kept moving. Until the night, everything changed. A whistle, a scream of iron, and then
A crash. One of their trains left the rails. Cars twisted like broken bones. Passengers thrown into the dirt. Fathers bleeding. Children crying in the smoke. Was it an accident, or was it deliberate sabotage? No one knew for certain, but everyone felt the truth in their bones. This was war.
This was no longer just business. It was survival. Because from that moment on, it wasn't about profit. It wasn't about competition. It was about whether a people could hold on to the one empire they had dared to build. And the question hung heavy in the air. Would their dream survive the storm, or be erased forever? Imagine building an empire, only to watch it vanish piece by piece. That was the aftermath of the black-owned railroad. Some lines simply collapsed. The money ran out. The enemies pressed too hard. Trains that once roared with pride now sat rusting in the weeds, swallowed by silence. Others were sold off in the dead of night, quiet signatures on contracts. Tracks handed over to rival companies who erased every trace of their origin. The names of black builders stripped from the records, replaced with those of white magnates. Families who had sacrificed everything, land, savings, lifetimes of labor, lost it all. Fortunes disappeared. Dreams turned into debts. Children grew up hearing whispers of what their parents had tried to do, but without the evidence, without the rails, the world refused to believe them. The leaders who once filled church halls with thunderous speeches, they faded into obscurity. Some died in poverty. Others moved north, chasing new opportunities, leaving behind the ghost of the railroad they had once built. And yet, the legacy refused to die. Because something had shifted. The tracks may have been stolen, but the spirit remained. Those communities were forever changed. Schools were funded. Businesses were sparked. A sense of pride, dangerous, powerful pride, was instilled. Children who once waved at passing trains now grew up with the knowledge, we can build, we can own, we can lead. And though history buried their names beneath the rubble of time, their impact was undeniable. Their tracks shaped generations, invisible but unbreakable. But here lies the haunting question. If their empire was so bold, so transformative, so defiant, why did the world forget them? The whistle of that train may have faded more than a century ago, but its echo is still with us. Because this story was never just about a railroad. It was about power. It was about resilience. It was about the most fundamental right of all, the right to move freely, to dream freely, to build freely.
Those tracks represented more than steel. They represented a declaration. We will not be confined. We will not be passengers in someone else's empire. We will build our own. And yet, look around today. Black entrepreneurs still face closed doors, still face banks that say no, still face laws, loopholes, and barriers that whisper the same words heard in the 1800s. This space is not for you. The struggle has changed its face, but the struggle remains. That's why remembering this railroad matters, not as a forgotten chapter in a dusty history book, but as a blueprint, as a warning, as an inspiration. Because if we forget their tracks, we risk derailing our own future. The story of the hidden black-owned railroad is not simply about trains. It is about defiance. It is about community. It is about daring to lay down rails where the world said none could exist. So let this be not the end of the story. Let it be a call. Share it, speak it, keep their memory alive. Because history tried to bury their empire, but tonight we just dug it back up.